The night sky over the Atlantic was almost unnaturally still, a vast black canvas stretching endlessly, broken only by the faint glimmer of distant stars and the occasional reflection of searchlights on the water. Somewhere beneath that darkness, thousands of Allied troops huddled inside transport ships and landing craft, rifles at the ready, hearts pounding with anticipation, each man acutely aware that the dawn of November 8, 1942 would either mark a triumphant beginning or a brutal disaster. For months, the operation had existed only on maps and in whispered orders, a secret plan known as Operation Torch, the Allied effort to seize control of North Africa and strike at the soft underbelly of Axis power in Europe. Now, after weeks of meticulous preparation and countless hours of coordination between American and British forces, it was no longer theory. It was about to become reality. The significance of the operation was clear to the commanders. North Africa was not just a patch of desert, it was a corridor between continents, a lifeline for the Mediterranean, and the staging ground for any future European assault. Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers, key ports along the North African coast, were the gateways to this strategic prize. Capturing them would secure supply lines, provide critical airfields, and establish the Allies' presence in a theater that had long been dominated by the Axis powers. Yet the planners also understood the risks. The French forces stationed there were officially loyal to Vichy France, the German-aligned regime that maintained nominal control over French North Africa. Fighting them would be morally complicated, and yet it might be unavoidable. Intelligence reports were conflicting, rumors of covert cooperation mixing with warnings of stiff resistance, creating a tension as thick and heavy as the sea mist that hugged the approaching landing craft. As the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, the soldiers felt the electric weight of expectation. Officers moved through the ranks, issuing final instructions, checking weapons, adjusting straps, and sharing terse words of encouragement. The men were trained, briefed, and armed, yet none could predict exactly what awaited them on the beaches. Some had spent weeks rehearsing amphibious landings, drilling endlessly on mock beaches in England, but reality was rarely as orderly as training exercises. Waves crashed over the sides of landing craft, the engines thrummed underfoot, and in the distance, the silhouettes of coastal defenses loomed like silent sentinels waiting to strike. The air was thick with a mixture of sea spray, gun oil, and the quiet fear that only soldiers in the prelude to battle can truly understand. At Casablanca, the largest landing point, the stakes were monumental. The port city was heavily fortified, with artillery positions strategically placed to dominate the shoreline, machine gun nests camouflaged among sand dunes, and naval assets ready to contest any attempt to enter the harbor. The Americans assigned here faced perhaps the most formidable challenge of the operation. They had been briefed repeatedly that resistance could be heavy, that casualties would be high, and yet, despite the fear and uncertainty, a fierce determination underpinned every action. As the landing craft nosed toward the shore, soldiers gripped rifles and bayonets, scanning the horizon for the first sign of enemy fire. The silence was oppressive, the calm before a storm that could erupt at any moment. When the ramps dropped and the soldiers charged the beaches, chaos erupted almost immediately. French artillery awakened with a sudden ferocity, firing shells that sent geysers of water and sand into the air around the landing craft. The sky, once calm and open, became a lattice of tracer fire and smoke. Explosions shook the water, the scent of gunpowder and seawater mingling in a nauseating haze. Despite the hail of fire, the troops pressed forward, scrambling over sandbags and debris, reaching the defensive positions with a mixture of precision and raw courage. Commanders barked orders over the roar of combat, medics dashed between the wounded, and every inch gained came at a cost. In that moment, the reality of war, a combination of fear, bravery, and brutal calculation, was laid bare. Offshore, the naval battle mirrored the chaos on land. French warships attempted to break through the Allied blockade, launching salvos against the transports and escort vessels. American destroyers responded with devastating counterfire, shells arcing through the sky before splashing into the sea with thunderous impact. Some French ships were sunk outright, others damaged and forced to retreat to the safety of the harbor. It was a strange and tragic encounter, Allies fighting Frenchmen, neither side truly wishing for this bloodshed, yet bound by the circumstances imposed by war and loyalty. By the end of the day, the naval element of the assault had achieved its objectives, but only after blood had been shed and strategy tested in real time. Far to the east, in Oran, the second major landing unfolded under equally tense circumstances. The geography here was less forgiving, rocky coastlines and narrow inlets made the approach treacherous, and French defenses were concentrated in bunkers overlooking the beaches. The American troops assigned to Oran had to navigate the jagged coastline under the threat of concentrated machine gun fire, artillery, and mines. The first wave met immediate resistance, forcing soldiers to adapt quickly. Engineers worked feverishly to clear obstacles while infantry pressed forward, each soldier relying on training, instinct, and sheer willpower. The harbor itself presented a special challenge. Any attempt to land directly onto the docks risked collision with underwater obstacles or concentrated gunfire. Courage alone was not enough, coordination, timing, and improvisation were equally crucial. Meanwhile, Algiers presented a very different type of challenge. Unlike Casablanca or Oran, the city was a political prize as much as a military one. Allied planners had conducted extensive covert negotiations with sympathetic French officers who were willing to assist once the landings began. This delicate underground network aimed to reduce casualties and accelerate the city's capture. When the Allied fleet appeared off the coast, the response was muted. Some French units refused to fire entirely, while others offered token resistance before surrendering or joining the Allies. By the end of the first day, Algiers had fallen largely intact, providing not only a strategic port but also a critical boost to Allied morale and legitimacy. The psychological dimension of warfare, convincing soldiers and commanders to switch sides, had proven just as important as the physical battle on the beaches. By nightfall, the situation across North Africa had dramatically shifted. Casablanca was still fiercely contested, Oran was slowly succumbing to the advancing troops, and Algiers had been secured with minimal losses. The first phase of Operation Torch, the risky landings, was complete, but the campaign had only just begun. Intelligence reports already indicated that German forces in Tunisia were mobilizing, aware that the Allies' foothold in Algeria and Morocco threatened to sever the Axis line in North Africa. For the Allied commanders, the initial success brought cautious relief, tempered by the knowledge that the real test, moving inland and confronting a prepared, determined enemy, lay ahead. As soldiers dug in for the night, the land, the sea, and the air seemed to hold their breath. The successes and failures of the day had been brutal, transformative, and unforgettable. Soldiers wrote hurried notes home, medics tended the wounded with grim efficiency, and commanders adjusted plans for the coming days. In the distance, the glow of fires from bombardments illuminated the coastline, a reminder that war leaves no place untouched. Yet, amidst the chaos and destruction, the first phase of Operation Torch had demonstrated that meticulous planning, audacity, and courage could combine to seize the initiative even in a world dominated by uncertainty and fear. And so, as the first night settled over the landing zones, a fragile calm returned. The beaches bore the scars of battle, ships rocked gently in the waves, and soldiers kept watch, knowing that every dawn could bring another test of skill, endurance, and resolve. The story of North Africa, of men and machines clashing in a high-stakes gamble, was only beginning, and the world would soon watch as the consequences of that gamble unfolded across deserts, mountains, and cities in a war that had already reshaped the globe. The race across Algeria, Allies advance, Axis reacts. The first light of dawn over Algeria revealed a landscape of paradox, serene, sunlit deserts stretching endlessly, yet shadowed by the remnants of a violent night. Operation Torch had begun with a chaotic symphony of landings, artillery, and desperate courage, and now the Allies faced the daunting task of turning footholds into strategic dominance. Casablanca, still burning in parts from the previous day's bombardments, and Algiers, freshly secured with little resistance, were only the beginning. The real challenge lay in moving eastward, across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain, to prevent German forces from consolidating in Tunisia. For General Eisenhower and his commanders, the pressure was immediate and merciless. Speed was essential, yet logistics, terrain, and climate threatened to undermine every plan. The advance began cautiously. Convoys of trucks, jeeps, and tanks snaked along narrow, winding roads that threaded through mountains and valleys. Supplies lagged behind, engines strained against sand and mud, and soldiers contended with fatigue, hunger, and the unpredictability of weather. Snow fell unexpectedly in higher elevations, turning dirt tracks into slurries of mud that swallowed wheels and slowed movement to a crawl. Despite these challenges, the Allied forces pressed forward with determination. Every kilometer gained was another opportunity to outpace German reinforcements racing from the east, yet every mile also carried the risk of ambush, artillery, or aerial attack. German commanders, aware of the stakes, acted swiftly. Hitler's orders were unequivocal: Tunisia must be reinforced immediately. Transport aircraft and convoys moved troops, tanks, and artillery into position, while Rommel, recovering from the retreat in Libya, coordinated with newly arrived German and Italian units. The Afrika Corps, exhausted but resilient, prepared to establish defensive lines in anticipation of Allied arrival. For Rommel, the strategy was simple yet brutal: delay the Allies, hold strategic passes, and exploit every natural barrier. The desert, with its mountains, wadis, and narrow coastal corridors, would become both shield and trap for the advancing forces. By the second week of November, the first real clashes occurred near the town of Jebel Abayad, a narrow pass where the terrain amplified the ferocity of the confrontation. American and British units moving eastward were suddenly confronted by entrenched German positions. Machine guns hidden among rocks tore through infantry lines, while mortars and artillery rained death from above. Tanks attempting to advance were ambushed from high ground, forced into desperate counterattacks under a barrage of shells. The fighting was chaotic and punishing. Every soldier quickly realized that this was not a simple march across Algeria but a trial by fire, where training, courage, and improvisation determined survival. Despite initial setbacks, the Allies adapted. Reconnaissance teams mapped enemy positions, engineers cleared obstacles, and air support targeted German strongholds. Paratroopers were deployed behind enemy lines to seize key crossroads and disrupt supply routes. The Allies' growing control of the skies allowed them to limit German movement and protect convoys, yet the environment remained merciless. Sudden rainstorms flooded roads, and long stretches of desert offered no cover from the blazing sun. Food and water were rationed carefully, while medics worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded. Every advance was a balance between opportunity and risk, a testament to the harsh realities of desert warfare. At the same time, Rommel's forces executed a series of tactical withdrawals designed to lure Allied units into traps while conserving their strength. The Desert Fox, ever mindful of timing, avoided full-scale engagements when it could, preferring to strike opportunistically. Patrols harassed convoys, mines delayed armor, and snipers targeted exposed soldiers. The Allies had numerical advantage, but the Germans had the benefit of experience, mobility, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The resulting confrontations were intense and unpredictable, leaving no room for error and testing the limits of Allied command. By late November, the Allies had secured key towns along the coast but had yet to achieve their ultimate objective, blocking Axis access to Tunisia. The clock was ticking, and every delay risked allowing German reinforcements to establish strong defensive positions. Commanders convened around maps in field headquarters, recalculating supply lines, troop movements, and potential routes for encirclement. Decisions were made with a combination of intelligence, intuition, and calculated risk, for each hour lost could change the balance between victory and disaster. Soldiers on the front lines felt this pressure indirectly, aware that their advance was part of a larger strategic gamble that extended far beyond the mountains and plains under their boots. As the Allied convoys moved inland, they encountered the first signs of the complex political terrain. Many local French units were loyal to Vichy authorities, and their response varied widely. Some units resisted fiercely, defending positions with artillery and machine guns, while others defected or surrendered without significant engagement. Allied negotiators worked tirelessly to secure cooperation, understanding that minimizing resistance would conserve lives and speed the campaign. The interplay of diplomacy and military action added a new layer of complexity, illustrating that the battle for North Africa was as much about hearts and minds as it was about artillery and tanks. The northward advance also brought logistical challenges that tested the ingenuity of Allied commanders. Fuel shortages threatened mobility, spare parts for vehicles were scarce, and long supply lines made each convoy a vulnerable target. Engineers built makeshift bridges, repaired damaged roads, and devised alternate routes to circumvent obstacles. Coordination between American and British forces required constant communication, often complicated by differing equipment, tactics, and operational styles. Yet despite these hurdles, the advance continued, fueled by determination and the high stakes of the campaign. Every town taken, every ridge secured, brought the Allies one step closer to Tunisia and one step closer to controlling the Mediterranean. By early December, the campaign had reached a critical juncture. Allied forces stood on the western approaches to Tunisia, facing both the natural defenses of the terrain and the organized resistance of German and Italian units. Reconnaissance indicated that Axis reinforcements had begun arriving from Europe, including tanks, artillery, and experienced infantry. Rommel, anticipating a final push, consolidated his forces and prepared to engage the Allies in a decisive manner. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine control of North Africa, and by extension, influence the entire course of the war in the Mediterranean theater. The coming weeks promised fierce combat, difficult decisions, and the harsh reality that war seldom follows the neat plans drafted on maps. Nightfall brought a brief respite. Soldiers dug in along ridges and riverbanks, while artillery crews recalibrated for dawn. Convoys returned to staging areas, medics counted and treated the wounded, and commanders reviewed intelligence reports for the next day's maneuvers. The desert, which had seemed empty and indifferent, now felt alive with possibility and threat. Each sound, the distant rumble of engines, the rustle of sand, the flash of distant artillery, reminded everyone that the battle was ongoing and that every advantage gained would come at a cost. As soldiers prepared for another day of marching, fighting, and improvising, a shared understanding permeated the ranks. The campaign in North Africa was no longer just a tactical exercise, it was a test of endurance, strategy, and human resolve. Tunisia, the desert tightens around the Allies*. The sun rose over the jagged ridges and narrow passes of Tunisia with a heat that promised no mercy. For the Allied forces pushing east from Algeria, the journey that had begun with the daring landings of Operation Torch had now become a grueling test of endurance, strategy, and nerve. Convoys that had once flowed smoothly along coastal roads now crept cautiously along twisting mountain paths, every curve and incline a potential ambush point. Soldiers, already fatigued by weeks of marching and skirmishes, adjusted their helmets and tightened straps on their packs, knowing that the days ahead would demand more than courage, they would demand unrelenting focus and adaptability. The desert, ever indifferent to human endeavor, seemed to watch with a patient menace, offering little shelter and fewer reprieves. Tunisia's terrain favored the defenders, and Rommel knew it. Unlike the wide-open sands of Libya or the relatively straightforward approaches in Algeria, Tunisia was a labyrinth of mountains, valleys, and riverbeds, punctuated by towns fortified for centuries. Each ridge could conceal artillery, each village could hide machine gun nests, and every narrow pass offered the potential for devastating ambushes. Rommel, seasoned by years of desert warfare, immediately recognized that the Allies' numerical superiority could be mitigated if his forces could force them into choke points. Intelligence and reconnaissance became paramount, every aerial sweep, every scout report, and every intercepted radio transmission could spell the difference between delay and disaster. The first major confrontation erupted near Kasserine Pass, a narrow corridor that represented one of the few direct routes to the interior. American units, relatively inexperienced in desert combat, found themselves suddenly facing a coordinated German attack combining armor, infantry, and artillery. Mortars fired from the high ground, shells tore through supply convoys, and tanks maneuvered with terrifying precision, exploiting every gap in the American lines. Panic threatened to set in as communication broke down under the strain of artillery and smoke. Yet amid the chaos, small units displayed extraordinary initiative. Officers and NCOs rallied men to hold critical points, while medics and support staff navigated treacherous terrain to reach the wounded. The battle was messy, brutal, and unlike any drill they had ever practiced, a crucible in which courage and ingenuity were as vital as numbers or firepower. Despite initial setbacks, the Allies adapted quickly. Engineers constructed makeshift bridges and cleared mines while reconnaissance units identified weak points in the German deployment. Air support, increasingly dominant in the theater, began to neutralize supply columns and soften entrenched positions. British forces under Montgomery coordinated flanking maneuvers, cutting off potential escape routes and gradually tightening the noose around Axis positions. The fighting was relentless, stretching the limits of logistics and morale. Convoys struggled to keep pace with front-line units, and every delay threatened to give Rommel time to regroup and reinforce. The desert's heat, sudden storms, and unforgiving terrain were enemies in themselves, claiming more fatigue and mechanical failures than bullets on some days. Rommel, however, was not idle. The Desert Fox orchestrated a series of counterattacks designed to slow the Allied advance and inflict maximum attrition. Tanks struck quickly at exposed flanks, infantry infiltrated gaps in supply lines, and artillery rained fire on roads and depots. German units, familiar with the local geography, exploited every ridge and canyon, creating ambushes that slowed convoys and forced units to fight in piecemeal engagements. Rommel's strategy relied on a combination of deception, mobility, and timing. He knew that a protracted frontal engagement favored the Allies' superior numbers, so instead he sought to dictate the rhythm of the battle, harass their lines, and force costly errors. As December turned into January, the campaign's intensity escalated. Allied forces, now operating with greater coordination and experience, pressed forward with a mixture of caution and aggression. Each town captured represented not just a tactical victory but a strategic opportunity, supply points, airfields, and staging areas for further operations. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, faced displacement and destruction, yet some towns saw local cooperation with Allied forces, providing intelligence and logistical assistance. The interplay of military action and civilian dynamics added complexity to the campaign, reinforcing the notion that victory in Tunisia required more than brute force. It required diplomacy, intelligence, and adaptability. One of the most intense clashes occurred near the town of Sidi Bouzid, where American forces faced entrenched German panzer units. The terrain forced armored units into narrow valleys, where mobility was restricted and tanks became vulnerable to concentrated fire. Artillery barrages ripped through defensive lines, while infantry maneuvered under constant threat of machine guns and sniper fire. The battle tested command structures, communication protocols, and the resilience of soldiers who had been exposed to weeks of continuous combat. Despite the ferocity of the engagement, lessons were learned, coordination between air and ground units improved, artillery was better synchronized with infantry movements, and logistical planning became increasingly sophisticated. Every setback became a stepping stone, forging a more effective fighting force capable of sustaining the prolonged struggle ahead. Meanwhile, in the north along the coast, British forces under Montgomery began consolidating positions around strategic ports and supply lines. Their experience from earlier desert campaigns provided a significant advantage, enabling them to fortify positions, establish reliable supply chains, and coordinate complex maneuvers across diverse terrain. Tanks and artillery were deployed to dominate key approaches, while engineers ensured that roads, bridges, and airfields were repaired or constructed to facilitate rapid movement. The coordination between British and American forces, though occasionally complicated by differing tactics and equipment, began to pay dividends. Units operated in concert, sharing intelligence and supporting each other in ways that had been impossible during the initial landings. By mid-February, Axis forces began to feel the cumulative pressure. German and Italian units were increasingly stretched, with supply lines overextended and reinforcements arriving slowly. The Allies' control of airspace disrupted resupply efforts, and naval patrols limited the movement of reinforcements along the coast. Rommel's tactical brilliance was undeniable, but even the Desert Fox could not compensate for the Allies' growing numerical advantage and improved coordination. Each victory, no matter how small, chipped away at the Axis defensive network, forcing retreats, recalibrations, and desperate improvisations. The desert that had once served as a natural ally to German forces now became a contested space where strategy, endurance, and sheer willpower dictated the pace of progress. The campaign had transformed into a high-stakes race across Tunisia, with each side jockeying for position, resources, and the initiative. The Allies had learned to adapt to the desert's challenges, integrating air support, engineering ingenuity, and multinational coordination into their operations. Axis forces, though skilled and determined, faced mounting difficulties as supply shortages, extended lines, and relentless pressure from multiple fronts eroded their ability to resist effectively. The stage was set for the final decisive phase of the North African campaign: encirclement, surrender, and the ultimate collapse of Axis control on the continent. The story of Tunisia was no longer merely about battles on sand. It was about strategy, endurance, and the complex interplay of human will, technology, and geography in a theater that tested every measure of military capability. The collapse of Axis power, victory in North Africa *. The sun rose over the mountains of Tunisia like a pale promise, casting long shadows across the ridges and valleys where months of relentless struggle had left their mark. For the Allied forces, the culmination of Operation Torch and the subsequent push across Algeria and Tunisia was now within reach. Weeks of grueling battles, exhausting marches, and tireless coordination had brought them to the doorstep of victory, yet the final phase would demand everything: tactical precision, logistical mastery, and unshakable determination. The Axis forces, battered and stretched thin, prepared to defend their last strongholds, but the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The desert that had once favored the defenders now bore witness to a turning tide, one that the Allies intended to ride all the way to triumph. The campaign's final confrontations centered around the northern approaches to Tunis and Bizerta, where geography, fortifications, and desperate resistance made every advance a battle in miniature. German and Italian troops, commanded by Rommel and his counterparts, fortified key towns, mountain passes, and coastal roads, creating a labyrinth of defensive positions designed to slow the Allied advance and inflict maximum casualties. Artillery was emplaced on ridges, machine guns hidden among the rocks, and mines scattered along every likely approach. Yet despite these preparations, Axis morale was deteriorating. Supply shortages, disrupted communication lines, and constant pressure from the increasingly coordinated American and British forces eroded the will to resist. The Desert Fox himself, ever cunning and resourceful, faced the grim reality that even his tactical brilliance could not overcome the overwhelming odds arrayed against him. Allied commanders, having learned from earlier setbacks and successes, approached the final phase with meticulous planning. Armored divisions were carefully positioned to exploit weaknesses in enemy lines, infantry coordinated with artillery and air support, and supply chains were reinforced to ensure that each forward push could be sustained. The combination of American logistical resources and British desert warfare experience proved decisive. Air superiority, once contested, now allowed reconnaissance planes to map enemy positions in detail, while fighter aircraft protected advancing columns and targeted Axis reinforcements. Commanders emphasized speed, accuracy, and adaptability, knowing that hesitation could allow the defenders to regroup or mount counterattacks that might undo weeks of progress. The first major engagement of this phase occurred near the town of Medjez el Bab, where narrow passes and hilly terrain concentrated the conflict. American and British units, advancing along multiple axes, met fierce German resistance. Tanks maneuvered through rocky corridors, exchanging fire with well-positioned panzer units, while infantry advanced under the constant threat of artillery and sniper fire. Despite the ferocity of the defense, the Allies leveraged superior numbers, coordinated strikes, and overwhelming artillery barrages to break through key points. Engineers cleared obstacles, while medics attended to the wounded under fire, exemplifying the combination of courage, skill, and endurance that defined the campaign. By nightfall, Allied forces had secured critical positions, opening a pathway to the approaches of Tunis. To the east, Bizerta, a strategic port city, became another focal point. Naval coordination played a crucial role here, with Allied ships providing artillery support and ensuring that supply lines remained open. The city, fortified with coastal batteries and supported by German and Italian garrisons, resisted fiercely. Yet the Allies' ability to combine land, sea, and air power overwhelmed the defenders. Tanks breached defensive positions, infantry stormed fortified points, and aircraft bombed artillery emplacements. By the end of several days of intense fighting, Bizerta fell, providing the Allies with a vital harbor to facilitate further operations and cementing their logistical advantage. The port's capture not only had strategic significance but also sent a psychological signal: the Axis grip on North Africa was weakening, and defeat was looming. Rommel, recognizing the inevitability of collapse, attempted a series of countermeasures to delay the Allied advance and preserve what remained of his forces. Mobile units struck supply columns, mines and obstacles were deployed to slow mechanized units, and limited counterattacks tested weak points in the Allied lines. Yet each action yielded diminishing returns. Allied forces, now operating with seamless coordination and bolstered by lessons learned in prior engagements, anticipated these maneuvers and neutralized them effectively. The German commander's strategic options narrowed, and the Desert Fox faced the bitter truth that the desert's once favorable terrain now amplified the Allies' advantages rather than masking his own vulnerabilities. By early May 1943, Axis forces were increasingly isolated, cornered in a shrinking area that left little room for maneuver. Morale among German and Italian troops deteriorated sharply, and shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies exacerbated the situation. Allied artillery and air raids made resupply virtually impossible, while constant pressure from advancing divisions left little opportunity to regroup. Commanders in the field faced impossible choices: fight to the last man, risk annihilation, or surrender in the hope of preserving lives. In many locations, local French units that had previously resisted or remained neutral now offered assistance, further tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. Every day that passed brought the Axis closer to an unavoidable conclusion. The final surrender of Axis forces in North Africa was formalized on May 13, 1943, a day that marked the end of a grueling, months-long campaign across two continents. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, massive quantities of equipment and artillery were captured, and the Allies secured control of the North African coast from Morocco to Tunisia. The victory was not merely tactical, it had profound strategic implications. With North Africa firmly in Allied hands, the Mediterranean Sea was opened for shipping, future operations in Sicily and mainland Italy were facilitated, and the morale of Allied forces worldwide received a significant boost. The campaign had demonstrated the effectiveness of multinational cooperation, combined arms strategy, and the integration of intelligence, engineering, and logistics into modern warfare. Beyond the immediate military outcomes, the North African campaign reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Control of North Africa disrupted Axis supply lines and threatened southern Europe, signaling to Germany and Italy that the Allies could project power across the Mediterranean. It also provided a proving ground for American forces, many of whom had experienced their first large-scale combat, gaining invaluable lessons in coordination, desert warfare, and combined operations. British forces, already seasoned from prior campaigns, reinforced their reputation for resilience and strategic planning. Together, the Allies' performance in North Africa laid the foundation for subsequent campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and beyond, creating momentum that would carry through the European theater. Civilians in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco bore witness to the war's destructive power but also its capacity to transform. Towns damaged by bombardments were slowly stabilized under Allied administration, while infrastructure improvements facilitated movement, supply, and communication. Intelligence networks, previously used to monitor Axis activity, were expanded to support governance, medical assistance, and humanitarian aid. The interplay between military operations and civilian considerations highlighted a broader truth of modern warfare: victory depended not only on defeating armed forces but also on managing populations, resources, and morale in a theater where every action had far-reaching consequences. As Allied commanders consolidated their gains, the campaign's lessons became clear. Flexibility in planning, rapid adaptation to terrain and enemy tactics, and seamless coordination between multinational forces had proven decisive. Air power, once an auxiliary tool, had become a central component of strategy, providing reconnaissance, fire support, and interdiction of supply lines. Logistics, often overlooked in narratives of heroism, emerged as a critical determinant of success, with well-supplied units consistently outperforming isolated or under-resourced formations. Above all, the campaign underscored the human dimension of war. Courage, leadership, endurance, and cooperation were as vital as tanks, artillery, and aircraft. By the time the last Axis forces surrendered, the desert was quiet once more, but its sands bore the imprint of countless battles, a testament to the struggle that had unfolded across Tunisia. Soldiers, weary but victorious, tended to the wounded, organized prisoners, and prepared to move forward toward new theaters of war. For the Allies, North Africa had become both a triumph and a training ground, a place where strategy, bravery, and perseverance converged to achieve what once seemed impossible. The victory was a turning point, a moment when months of planning, fighting, and adapting culminated in a result that would influence the course of the global conflict. In retrospect, the North African Campaign Operation Torch and the subsequent drive into Tunisia was more than a military success. It represented the effective integration of multinational forces, the ability to overcome logistical and environmental challenges, and the decisive use of intelligence and strategy. It tested the resolve of soldiers and commanders alike, demanding not only tactical skill but also endurance, innovation, and human willpower. The collapse of Axis power in North Africa reshaped the Mediterranean theater, opened the door for further Allied operations in Europe, and demonstrated that even in the harshest deserts, with the most determined enemy, careful planning, courage, and adaptability could turn the tide of war.